Welcome, everybody. My name is Jim Secord, and I teach in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science here in the university. This event, as you know, is called When Was Reproduction Invented? I wanted to find out at the last moment. I was a bit unsure about where the event was within John's, and so I typed in when was reproduction into Google, and the answer came back 2 billion years ago, which, of course, from a historical point of view, gives us lots of scope for time and thinking about reproduction in lots of different ways. But the answer, in fact, that they give is rather reductive. What it says is this is the point at which bacteria began to exchange genetic information. Now, whether that's the right date or not, I'm not quite sure from the point of view of geneticists, but from the point of view of historians and indeed most evolutionary biologists, I think there's a much more interesting range of issues and questions to be asked about this kind of issue. For one thing, just think about the very name, reproduction. What are we talking about when we talk about reproduction? If you were in a group of sound engineers and you talked about reproduction, we'd be talking about the kind of problems that we're having tonight. And I should add to that not only does the microphones not work, but also the clicker doesn't work. So the speakers that have slides are going to have to carry the sound equipment over to the speaker's desk rostrum in order to say what they have to say. The point about that is actually, I think, kind of interesting, and it is basically that reproduction can have lots of meanings for us. It can mean physical things can reproduce. There's, of course, a question about when rocks crystallize, how does that relate to the way that, say, viruses change and develop? These are kind of, when does the organic shift into the organic and vice versa? These are really central questions in evolutionary biology. In history, I think, if anything, they're more striking. The nature of reproduction and what we think reproduction is, how it occurs, what sex is, what gender is, the way in which different sexes contribute to the act of reproduction. These issues, I think we all have some basic feeling and knowledge that these have changed a lot. And part of that is, of course, the reason is that they're changing a lot right now. And it's made us, I think, particularly acute and acutely aware of the way in which these changes have occurred in the past. Now, what we're going to be doing today is we've got a panel, basically, of 4 people from the university who have great expertise in this question of the way reproduction and how we think about it has developed over very long time spans. The project that we're involved in here, it initiated out of a series of Wellcome-funded research from the 2000s, basically looking at how reproduction changed over a very long time span. One problem with historians, as you probably realize, is sometimes they look at quite narrow periods. I myself often focus on periods of about a year or so. Obviously, most historians maybe focus on slightly longer time spans, but to have something that goes all the way from ancient Greece and the classics and Roman times up to the very present and what's happening in the news today, that's quite unusual within a historical project. And so these Wellcome grants really brought that all together. They issued out in this large book, which looks like a really quite forbidding academic tome, but in fact, I think is a really wonderful compendium of knowledge all about the different ways that reproduction has actually been thought about in different periods. In fact, what we're going to see is that in many ways, the word reproduction isn't that appropriate a title for earlier periods. It's something that helps us to understand and think about it, but there's a whole range of other issues involved. Just so that you can see it, we've got a copy of the book. It's actually normally a very expensive book, but as the Times Literary Supplement said, it was expensive but worth it. The great news is that there's a 40% discount now. So you can pretend that you're actually an author of the book, because 40% is what authors get on this, or editors get, and you can actually buy the book as though you had written it yourself. And part of the purpose of this session is we're going to be opening up around halfway during it to the audience for questions and commentary of their own. So we're going to start, first of all, with brief comments by each one of the participants in order. We have Rebecca Fleming will be starting out. She's senior lecturer in classics and has written a book called Medicine and the Making of Roman Women gender, nature, and authority from Celsus to Galen. And she's going to get us started off in talking about some of the crucial ways that reproduction changed during the ancient period.
Okay, so I'm from the classics faculty. I'm an ancient historian, and what I'm going to tell you about right now very briefly is about, in a nutshell, what is the kind of ancient contribution to the creation of generation and reproduction, to this whole story of the beginning to now of generation and reproduction. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the issue of what changed within the classical period. How is it different, what comes out of that than went before? And I'm going to argue that there was some really quite serious changes. And I'm going to argue that there was some really quite serious changes looking sort of in terms of what was there before and what comes after, but also that this is particularly significant. That the point we arrive at in the classical world is one which is going to have enormous ramifications going forwards. So that this is, if you like, the crucial change, or at least is in the competition for that. So, my kind of summary of this is, my kind of 3 takeaway points are going to be that in the ancient Mediterranean world, apart from getting really nice, cute votives of babies and mothers, that this is when we have the first surviving written theories of generation. So generation, what is genesis, in Greek or Latin, this idea about people writing down an explanation for how the whole process of making new human beings, new animals, new plants works. So for the first time, we get written texts which engage in thinking about how the whole process works and explaining that. So that's number 1. Number 2 is the first surviving discussions of the ideal size of population of a state. We're talking, in the ancient world, we're talking city-states, but there's a kind of demographic discussion, there's a political discussion about what size state do you want, how large would your population be, and about how you would go about achieving that. So measures for that. And then there's the third point, which is that this is going to fit into a broader pattern of there being legislation, a legal framework, which is about supporting people's family projects, their reproductive projects in general. And then there's going to be some particular state action to promote people having children and families. So those are my kind of 3 takeaway points. And just to quickly go through them. So I am not claiming, so there's quite a lot at stake in the first surviving written. All of those things have to kind of go together. So I'm not claiming that there was no interest in generation reproduction before this, and I'm not claiming that there might not have been theories before this, and particularly there are certainly writings, medical writings that survive, for example, from ancient Egypt or from the ancient Near East in terms of thinking about the Mediterranean world. But they tend to be very practical. So they're all, if X, then do Y. And some of the things to do with Y might be to do with children, but that's not generally, it's not about theories, it's not about explanations, which isn't to say they didn't have them, but they're not writing them down. Whereas in the Hippocratic corpus, so in 5th century, late 5th century, early 4th century BC Greek world, we start to get texts which are called things like On Seed, which are about the material that is the sort of essential generative stuff that is going to help drive this process of making new beings. We start to get discussions on seed, we start to get discussions on explaining how that is held in the woman's womb, how the 2 seeds from the man and the woman mix together, start to form into a fetus that's then nourished by the female body through the stuff, through other material that would be otherwise excreted through menstruation. And then on the Hippocratic model, the fetus eventually runs out of food and, a bit like a chick in an egg, cracks open the womb, gets itself out of the bonds that are binding it, and is born. The woman just doesn't do anything on the Hippocratic model at all. But we have a whole series of discussions about how this all works and how it matters in terms of women's lives. And although the Hippocratics would go for both male and female seed, there's a lot of other discussions, but everybody in this context has got a really serious role for both men and women, and that's crucial. It's not equal, ancient world, not an equal world, pretty patriarchal, but both male and female are making vital contributions to the offspring, to this whole process. And then we have Plato and the Republic and his laws, Aristotle and the Politics, again, early 4th century texts where they're talking about their ideal societies, how many people would there be in them. Plato thinks 5,040 would be his perfect number. I can explain to you how he arrives at that, but he has a very precise number. And he's got a set of legislation about marriage, who's going to be allowed to marry each other, that they should be allowed to marry at certain ages so that you get the best children. There's a lot of thought about how all of that should work in the political world that ties in with the ideas about generation. And then the last point would be that this is operating in a world in which there are a set of laws about marriage, about legitimate children, which are set up to help people pursue projects which are about family continuity. This is a world in which people want to have children in order to pass on their family name, their family cult, their memories, as well as any property that they might have. This is a world of very high infant mortality, so this is something that you have to really work quite hard at. So one of the things that you make sure that you can do is, if your current marriage is not producing children, you should obviously be able to divorce and remarry. This is a basic kind of activity, and we see quite a lot of it in particular in the Roman world, and the reason that people divorce is in order to remarry. That's a kind of very simple point. So we have a whole set of things. We have adult adoption, divorce, remarriage, which are about setting up this basic structure that will support these kind of family enterprises. And then eventually we have the Emperor Augustus legislating to encourage the marriage and the production of children by penalizing through inheritance people who aren't married and have children, and rewarding those who are married and have children. If you're a man, you get rewarded by political advantage. If you're a woman, you get rewarded by closer to legal autonomy. So my kind of idea is that you get these crucial debates going, that everything joins up. We have theories of generation as a physical process. We have theories about the state and about politics and about how you influence that. And we have real action on the ground. This isn't just kind of abstract. People do act on it. They have infertility treatments based on these ideas. They support child birth based on these ideas. They have legislation that is also operative around this. And I want to finish just on the last point, which is that, so I said this is first surviving written. And this is really important, both because there could have been all sorts of stuff that's lost, and I'm sure there was, but also the fact that it's written means that it can travel over time and space much more easily. So these are the ideas about seed, about generation, and so on. These are ideas that are going to be translated into Syriac and Arabic. They're going to travel right across the kind of Ptolemaic world, as it were, to the east. They're going to travel into North Africa and down the coast of Africa. And in fact, they're going to travel off this map into the New World, the bits that Ptolemy didn't know about, and further kind of east. You may or may not be able to recognize that. I think that's Sri Lanka. But they're going to go even further into Indonesia. And by writing, which is one of the kind of key ideas in the book about communication, by writing, it can spread and we can have these debates, and these ideas will continue to thrive. Thank you very much.
Okay, our next speaker is Lauren Purcell, who's in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at Cambridge. She's an expert on early modern history, and she's going to be speaking about her work relating to that.
Thank you, Rebecca, for kicking us off, and thank you, Jim, for the introduction. So our question today is, when was reproduction invented? So the question for me becomes, was reproduction invented in medieval and early modern Europe? That is between roughly 1100 and 1700? My answer is no. So we could stop there, but I actually have quite a lot to say. The answer is no, because procreation during these centuries was understood as a much more eclectic set of notions, often labeled as generation. And at the same time, generation was the concern of an increasingly broad range of people. This included physicians, philosophers, theologians, but also women and artisans. And this is why these early centuries are so useful for thinking about what reproduction, and I put it in scare quotes there, means. So reproduction was not invented in medieval and early modern Europe, but history was invented in medieval and early modern Europe. Specifically, history was invented around 1500. This is when scholars who were seeking to recover the true knowledge of antiquity, the stuff that Rebecca is talking about, that had been lost, this knowledge had been lost during the intervening, what they called dark ages, what other people call the Middle Ages. They designated these scholars around 1500, they designated themselves as modern, meaning now for them. Hence, we now call them early modern. And their modernity was marked by discoveries and innovations, usually symbolized by the printing press, the compass, and gunpowder. So those are the technologies of big histories of knowledge, politics, and economics. And these big histories have a narrative arc. That's a beginning, a middle, and an end. This is a generational model of history in which an era improves on the one that came before. Yet studying the history of reproduction before reproduction, which is what I do and what Rebecca does, requires us to grapple with unresolvable tensions between natural and normative understandings of knowledge and practices, between biological realities and cultural conventions, and thus studying reproduction before reproduction lends itself not to this generational model, but to what we can call a genealogical model. In a generational model of history, reproduction, as Nick is going to tell us, I think, was invented in the 18th century. In a genealogical model of history, the invention of reproduction in the 18th century is one of many interconnected threads, lines, lineages of activity and understanding. Hence the importance of including the voices of women and artisans and other people. So in the generational model, the history of reproduction begins in the 1700s. In a genealogical model, we need to begin, as our book begins, in Antiquity. So by considering the period 1100 and 1700, we challenge, or at least trouble, a number of before and after, these big arc accounts of procreative matters that are taken for granted by many people, including historians. The same subjects are often treated as stories of loss or stories of progress, depending on one's perspective. So for instance, I'm just going to take you through 5 of them very quickly. The first one is the medicalization of childbirth was a triumph of science over superstition. Or the medicalization of childbirth was the loss of women's knowledge. Neither story is wholly correct. Medieval and early modern women did not practice natural childbirth, and they were not necessarily frightened that they would die. Secondly, before 20th century reproductive technologies, men and women had no real means to control or promote their fertility. That's a story that people tell, a before and an after story. In fact, medieval and early modern men and women exercised numerous means known to them to vary in their efficacy to prevent pregnancies and to promote fertility. Thirdly, population and family are static universal categories, which they're not, right? Population as a notion didn't exist, though the multitudes were sometimes counted, often literally through putting beans in bags. Family was a capacious category which was inflected with notions of blood and affection, but also of honor, status, and property, as Rebecca has already said, and as I'm sure Susan will say more about. Fourthly, women were either sexually repressed or sexually rampant. Even in a Christianized Europe, life was much more complicated than a stark juxtaposition between Eve the temptress and Mary the virgin. What's especially interesting for us are medieval and early modern debates about whether women had to experience pleasure and thus to emit seed in order to become pregnant. Fifthly, a woman didn't know she was pregnant until she felt the child move, and thus she might take action to promote menstruation and thus to abort, wittingly or not, the fetus. Not true. Quickening, the movement of the child, was only one sign of pregnancy, and many people, not just women, were attentive to these signs. In addition, when life began, ranging from the moment of conception to the moment of birth or beyond, has been debated for many centuries. So studying the people who lived between 1100 and 1700, these are arbitrary dates, to study these people without romanticizing or denigrating, either one, romanticizing or denigrating their experiences or ideas, teaches us how to understand the history of reproduction in its fullest sense across history. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. So our next speaker is Professor Nick Hopwood, also in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. He's worked a great deal on the history of reproduction and embryology, especially its visual aspects, and is the author of a book called Haeckel's Embryos, which is about a famous case in which apparently fraudulent images of embryos were much debated throughout Europe and the United States.
Thank you, Jim. So as Jim said at the beginning, if we approach reproduction like a biologist, then of course it goes back even before humans evolved. But if we approach it as a matter of knowledge and practice, then it has a shorter history. Now I agree with Lauren and Rebecca that important layers of current approaches to reproduction were laid down in Antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the early modern period. But if I have to choose one era when reproduction as we know it was invented, then that has to begin in the mid-18th century. Now this is the standard view, but it's too often presented as a flash of innovation. I'm going to recast it as a slow-burning flame that took much of the 19th century to light a fire. Now the idea is that from around 1750, there was a shift from generation to reproduction. As we've heard, generation was a broad framework for like begetting like. In the early 18th century, it applied especially to humans and beasts, but also to plants and still even to minerals. Much was mysterious, and people tried to understand it through comparisons to artisanal activities such as brewing and baking. Reproduction, by contrast, is more abstract. It refers to the capacity shared by all living organisms, and them alone, to produce more of their kind. Now, it wasn't a new word in the mid-18th century, but this meaning was cultivated among Enlightenment intellectuals and administrators who were interested in the renewal of resources, and most famously by Buffon, the director of the French King's Garden. In 1749, Buffon wrote in his very successful multi-volume Natural History, "Let us examine more closely this property common to animal and plant, this power to produce its likeness, this chain of successive individual existences, which constitutes the real existence of the species. Let us look in general at the phenomena of reproduction." This was read as new. The Methodist leader, John Wesley, who objected to Buffon's atheism as he saw it, complained that Buffon substitutes for the plain word generation a quaint word of his own, reproduction, in order to level man not only with the beasts that perish, but with nettles or onions. Now, reproduction as a concept was powerful precisely because people could share concepts and practices across species more directly. It was powerful also in the way that it links individual and species or population. Modern population thinking and practices were also invented in the later 18th century. But everything didn't suddenly change in 1749 or even by 1800. Historians don't yet really know in detail how reproduction did catch on, or even exactly what were the connections between concepts and practices. But it's clear that it took much of the 19th century for people to adopt this new approach. That applies to the word. In dictionaries and encyclopedias, reproduction didn't take over from generation as the general term for procreation until after 1850. And it applies to practices. Now, there were new practices that did start in the later 18th and early 19th centuries. Breeding livestock for improvement, for example, rather than just to stop decline. Techniques for managing populations. There was a revival of censuses and civil registration that produced more mathematical approaches to fertility and mortality. And just to give a third example, man midwifery pushed women and midwives out of the high-class end of the trade in childbirth. These practices did start, and very importantly so, but they had a limited reach. Few people read books or had access to regular medicine. Most farmers carried on as before, and governments hesitated to become involved in such intimate and controversial matters. Those were also marginalized as women's business. They weren't much taught in universities or schools. But by the decades around 1900, when most industrialized countries were in the midst of a transition from large to nuclear families, by then governments had legislated, for example, to restrict abortion and contraception. And talk about reproduction was tying together various domains. The author H.G. Wells wrote in 1901, "The main mass of the business of human life centers about reproduction." He also suggested that half of the human race shouldn't reproduce. Now, by this time, ordinary couples could follow these debates. But whether they did or not, it was the cumulative effect of their decisions, increasingly to have fewer children, that set the frame, just as they were surrounded by reproductive practices and controversy. Now, you might say, that's all very well, but has the process gone far enough towards our brave new world, towards a more complete separation of sex and reproduction? After all, it's only after World War II that we have medicalized contraception as actually the duty of a citizen, that we have most women giving birth in hospital, reproductive biology as a field of research, and the innovations that I expect Susan will highlight. But our question is about invention. And for that I say, with all due respect to earlier and later centuries, that the mid-18th century is as early as we should start, and the years around 1900 are as far as we need to go. Thank you very much.
So our next speaker is Susan Gallenbach. She's Professor of Family Research and Director of the Center of Family Research at the University of Cambridge. They're in the lovely new part of the buildings that have been just reconstructed in the center of Cambridge. So you can actually see the building much more clearly now than you used to be able to do. And she's the author of a book called Modern Families, Parents and Children in New Family Forms, which is part of her general interest in the way in which changing social formations and changing technologies have really transformed in many ways.
Thank you, Jim. So, I'm going to argue that reproduction was reinvented in 1978, particularly in this country. And there were two major events that happened here. Firstly, in January, the now defunct London Evening newspaper carried out an expose of a Harley Street doctor who was helping lesbian couples to have children through sperm donation. And the journalist pretended to be such a couple, and then printed this article, and which led to a huge furore in the country. Questions were asked in the House of Commons, questions were asked in the House of Lords. The general public was outraged because the idea of lesbian women having children was something that was completely new to most of the population. And in fact, donor insemination, because it was generally something that was hushed up, carried out in secrecy, again, was a way of having children that was not familiar to most people. Then, just 6 months later, there was another sensation with the birth of Louise Brown, the first test tube baby, so the first child ever to be conceived outside the human body. And in fact, as this is a historical session, I rather like this quote from Time magazine that described it as the most awaited birth in perhaps 2,000 years. If we fast forward to today, we now have more than 8 million babies born through IVF worldwide. And we now have same-sex marriage in almost 30 jurisdictions around the world, which has resulted in also large numbers of children. So how did we get from there to here? Partly it was through developments in technologies that assisted reproduction. So donor insemination was happening long before 1978, but it certainly became much more widely used after the interest in fertility issues resulting from the birth of Louise Brown. Egg donation, the first time a woman ever gave birth to a child with who she had no genetic connection to, happened in Australia in 1984. Embryo donation also became possible. So this was like adoption in that the child lacked a genetic connection to both parents, but the difference was that the parents experienced the pregnancy and the child's birth. And surrogacy, now traditional surrogacy where the surrogate's egg was used dates back to biblical times, but surrogacy which allows the intended mother's egg to be used so that she's also the genetic mother, not just the social mother of the child, also became possible after the introduction of IVF. But it wasn't just new reproductive technologies that caused these seismic changes in the way in which children could be related or not to their parents. social attitudes also changed. And again, there was a big shift in the 1970s with the growth of the gay liberation movement and the growth of the women's movement. And today we have single mothers, lesbian couples having children through assisted reproduction, through donor insemination. We have single men and gay couples having children through egg donation and surrogacy. There's an increasing trend towards co-parenting where either a heterosexual or a lesbian woman will co-parent with a heterosexual or a gay man or a couple where the two don't have an intimate or romantic relationship, but sometimes meet over the internet or through other means solely for the purpose of raising children together. So children are growing up often with 3 parents, with 4 parents, in the case of, say, a lesbian couple and a gay father family having children together. And more recently, transgender people are able to have children after they transition. So through the freezing of eggs in trans men and the freezing of sperm in trans women, then after changing to their desired gender, it's possible for parents to have children. And probably one of the most notable examples recently was the man who gave birth to a child, the trans man, that had a lot of press attention. And he is now trying to persuade the government to allow him to be named as the child's father on the birth certificate. So the stirrings of change in 1978 have really had a fundamental change, I would say, on the way reproduction is carried out. And as we go forward, we have more and more women selectively deciding to freeze their eggs to postpone childbearing. We now have children born through uterus transplants. It was just announced last week that a research group in Eindhoven had been given a large amount of funding to develop artificial wombs. Artificial eggs and sperm are on the horizon, which again would be a treatment that would help infertile couples, but it would also allow lesbian and gay couples to have their own biological children. And perhaps the most recent controversy is to do with germline genome editing, whereby a Chinese scientist in November announced that he had caused a pair of twins to be born whose genes had been edited, which caused a huge furore, and the effects are still rippling out around the world, because this means that the changes to the genome will be passed from generation to generation, and nobody knows the effects of this, and particularly there are huge concerns about unwanted and dangerous effects. So I would just like to end by saying that the past 40 years represent one of the greatest turning points in the history of reproduction. Thank you.
I'm not exactly sure whether this is really a competition or not, whether at the end of each one of these we should have put 3 or 5 sort of, strictly reproducing or something like that. But it is quite clear that there's some really quite interesting questions here about what invention means, what reproduction is, and when these crucial changes really happen. I think it's, as much as anything to me, it struck me as what a crucial change really is, what you're talking about in terms of what it means, how specifically you're talking about reproduction as opposed to the general conspectus of ideas around generation and reproduction. It's also quite clear, I think, that there's a question, for me at least, about what the nature of invention is. Are we talking here about that moment when Buffon writes that crucial phrase? That's invention, and if you're going to go for that, 1749 seems quite a good thing. But maybe that's a bit narrow. Another way to view it is that actually this moment in the very early period, when for the first time people are writing down and deciding to have the whole genre of writing down theories, so that the activities that Buffon's doing are actually present. And to be honest, I'm quite a big fan of going back further than that. These practical treatises, quite often behind them, have all sorts of information, knowledge, belief that's communicated by other means, and it's quite obvious that that's going on. And so isn't the case that those ancient Assyrian or Babylonian recipes actually represent something that is much more significant here? But of course, then you could go back even further. So we're actually in quite an interesting stage here. We're not going to let you vote at the end of this thing. I think that's not probably the most historians don't like deciding things by votes. I think maybe there are other things that should be decided by votes. But I just wondered, particularly, it seems like one of the key conflicts here is whether this is basically something that has been around for a very long time and really has its origins in the general origins of philosophy in ancient Greece, or whether it's something that has something to do with what we often call modernity, whether it's the moment in the 18th century modernity, or whether it's some later point in that, or whether indeed it's something that's really quite contemporary. I wondered if we could just very briefly, if you could, Rebecca particularly, if you could comment on what you think about all these modernists.
I mean, in some sense, so as Jim says, this isn't a competition, and this is much more a kind of collective dialogue where claims and counterclaims are productive in terms of getting people to think about differences, continuities, and I suppose on the one hand, we could have a sort of philosophical discussion about what counts as invention. On the other hand, I guess I'd probably rather have a discussion which is about generation and reproduction and hear what people kind of want to say on that. So I think I'm going to sort of abstain a little bit on, but I'm reluctant to let people who invent words win.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well that's a good answer. Nick, I wondered if...
I mean, I think one useful way of making progress with this is to focus on some particular issues. I mean, a little bit like when Lauren talks about those myths of change and progress. I mean, particular attention has been paid, for example, to the history of infertility. And so people do often emphasize, as Susan rightly has, how much has changed since 1978. But one can also go back, I think, very usefully to the decades around 1900, which is really when the idea of pursuing a solution to infertility as a kind of consumer medical project is set up. That's something that Christina Benninghaus argues in a chapter in the book. And so that is her claim for when, in a way, modern infertility is invented as something rather different. But contributors to the book also argue, and Rebecca herself has argued this in particular, that it's a bit of a myth of modern historians that the whole idea of doctors treating infertility is a new thing in the modern era. That actually that is there in ancient Greece already, and that's an important field in which physicians are active right through the centuries. So we can see that continuity, but we can also see these rather important changes that set up the very possibility of that kind of project of infertility as something for which you go to a doctor, or perhaps more than one doctor. And then these dramatic changes that really mean or facilitate new kinds of families in the very recent past.
What I would like to highlight, which in part addresses the question that Jim tried to aim at Rebecca, but doesn't answer it either, is that what all of my colleagues have done is shown the way. I mean, Rebecca set it out very, very nicely in terms of her tripartite set of factors, right? You have the state, you have theories of generation, and you have ideas of population. And you have all of these different, moving from the theoretical to the more practical, not practical in terms of what happens necessarily in the bedroom, but actually it does have implications for it. That constellation moves through time, right? And so what's very interesting listening to Nick and Susan talk is that you begin to question at each point, having Rebecca's framework in place, what's driving these changes. We can all come up with really basic continuities in reproduction, right? If you just leave it alone, there's some really basic continuities. But when you start messing with things, then the question becomes, is it science that's driving it? You know, did that Chinese doctor have to do this because a couple wanted him to? I doubt it. The couples in 1978, they were driving it despite what a public might have wanted them to do. So you see these tensions playing themselves out. But the configuration of the three factors is always there. It's just the balance is shifting. And I recognize things are very different in later centuries.
Well, I guess I'm the odd one out here as a non-historian. So I'm a developmental psychologist. I study child development. So some of these questions are not the kinds of questions I would normally think about. On the other hand, I found it really fascinating listening to all of your presentations, because many of the things you said to me were just a real eye-opener. I mean, it seemed to me that treatments for infertility are something that are very contemporary, but then you were talking about this happening so long ago. And then it made me think, being a bit of an empiricist, you know, if there weren't really any effective treatments, as far as we know, till fairly recently, what did that mean?
I think we could probably. I think one of the things this raises in quite an interesting form is that we've got everyone from someone who's effectively so much part of the contemporary scene they don't really think about history that much, and on the other hand, we have people who are deep enough in history that effectively the kind of question that might be phrased by a very general, 2,000, 3,000 year history is actually a framework that poses things in a way that doesn't exactly fit very well. So in a way you always feel like everyone's being pushed into various boxes in a certain way, and I think it's quite an interesting issue about how to get around that. And I do think one of the things that is helpful about looking at the very early periods, I think, and Lauren brought this out very well just now, is that some of these very basic questions, when you look at something like reproduction, have a kind of contour about what the main issues are. Population, the question of how to put together a theory about how it actually happens. These sorts of things go on over very long time spans, and I think getting historical questions that allow you to think over that kind of long time span is actually a very helpful thing, and that's indeed what we're really trying to do here, I think, in many ways.